I just couldn't understand why we weren't taking more risks. You go into town halls and you talk about it, people would nod and they'd smile and feel great, and then they'd leave and go back to their day-to-day job and things wouldn't change. In the case of a startup, you have to reframe where you're going. So you can't go in and have that conversation and talk about the miserable failure. What you can do is go in and talk about having great failures. I was diagnosed with dyslexia quite late. It was almost my senior year of high school. My folks certainly knew something wasn't working quite right when I was younger, but didn't really have it pinned until really later into high school. Even if you talk to the founders of Google, they will tell you the notion of search was never given to give you an answer. It was actually to give you a variant number of other possibilities and additional questions.
What do you think is the role that trust plays in growing and keeping that engagement?
The threshold for willingness is only going to go up, and it all erodes in a heartbeat the minute the trust is broken.
Tariq Hassan has held leadership roles at Petco, HP, Bank of America, and Omnicom, and now advises a wave of AI and advertising companies trying to reshape the future of marketing. Most recently at McDonald's, he led marketing through a transformation that built a data-driven, app-powered customer platform, shaping how one of the world's biggest brands connects with its customers at scale. But his most counterintuitive ideas have nothing to do with marketing. They're about why successful companies quietly stop innovating, even when nothing on paper looks broken, and the ghosts that shape our behavior.
You got to challenge the intimacy behind the data. Data in and of itself is not always just a straight red, yellow, green light response to things. Sometimes it's actually having the conversation, asking questions behind the data that leads you into the real powerful outcomes.
If you had to pick 3 values as game changers, what would those be? This episode is sponsored by Shopify. Before we get into the episode, I'd really appreciate if you take a second to hit subscribe now. Every subscriber matters and helps the show have an opportunity to grow and reach more people. Plus, you'll be the first to hear about what else is coming your way. Thanks for being here. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. This is In Community with Fahad Khwaja. Tariq Hassan, welcome to In Community. I appreciate you being here today.
Great being here. It's good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you as well. I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in. I'd love to start by actually understanding a little more about you and maybe hearing what not everyone out there knows. Can you tell me a little bit about one of your earliest memories?
Oh gosh, I love this question, and it won't surprise you. But I come from a big family. And so my earliest memories are definitely of me and family. Gosh, I think back like literally my earliest memory. I was thinking about this, trying to recall what would that be. And it is a family moment. I recall being a small child and sitting on the lap of my grandfather in a house full of festivities of normal day of having a big Lebanese family. And I would say most of my memories probably resolve around what it is to be part of a great family.
How big a family was it?
Well, my immediate family's not that big. My dad's the oldest of 11. Mom's another 4 aunts and uncles. And so the extended family is pretty large, which in our house, it was never just immediate family. It was always extended family, around, and we were always that family. So.
Wow. Yeah. And 11, one of 11 is a lot. I mean, my mother's side, had a lot of siblings as well. My dad's side is a little smaller. So I feel that I have a ton of cousins. So I'm right there with you.
Yeah. Yeah, we have the cousins and the unofficial cousins and the unofficial aunts and uncles, right? It's like, it's just your ecosystem of life, and I love it. Those absolutely fill and color all of my memories.
Yeah, there's some people out there where I'll meet them after years and I won't be quite sure how we're related, but I know we're related somehow. Yeah. Where did you grow up? Tell me a little bit about that community.
So I was born in Toledo, Ohio, but I was raised in London, Ontario, and both of those communities were rich in old, early immigrant Middle Eastern families. Both my grandfathers immigrated in 1908 and 1912. And so long history of both families in both U.S. and Canada. But then that extension came from the number of people who immigrated and at some point came through my grandparents' homes and formed the community I grew up in.
Did you have a sense early on of where you wanted to go, when you grew up? Did you know whether you wanted to stay? Did you have a sense of what industry you wanted to get into?
Oh gosh, no. I mean, going like early days of thinking what I wanted to do, I would have told you I wanted to play professional baseball. I played baseball growing up my whole life and played well into college years. And, there was a window of time when I initially, if you asked most of my friends, they would have said they thought I was destined for law school. And I was at one point. marketing and making the transition to the States all came about sort of organically and by happenstance of what was going on around me at the time, to be honest.
Tell me more about that. How did that transition happen?
It's the proverbial out of college. Do I really want to do another 3 years of law school? And after spending a year working and being exposed to what I would later come to understand as marketing and communications, decided to go back to grad school. And rather than doing a traditional MBA, I wanted to go do something that had a little bit more of my creative brain as well. And so I ended up at Northwestern doing my graduate work in integrated marketing and communications, where I lived in both the worlds of sort of the traditional MBA curriculum, but also back then, to age myself, the burgeoning world of, what we now are talking about as one-to-one marketing, but early direct marketing and the blend of communications together and looking at them in an integrated way.
And since then, I know you've worked at obviously a number of really large companies, some really influential companies with some really, really well-known brands that have, grown and changed and evolved over the years. As you look back and look at some of those influential brands, I'm wondering, was there an example of a time when you were working on something where the right group of people came together and actually, turned something that seemed risky into a win?
The first part of my career was agency world. And I think that actually, to answer your question, I think working in the agency world, that's what we did on a daily basis, right? We solved client challenges and client problems. And so I think that became something rather than the rarity that I would think about, like, wow, that's a moment when this amazing group came together. The first part of my career, I think I developed it as part of this is what we got up and did every day, as we looked for that understanding of the business problem and looked deep into the customer and the business to find that unique little needle in the haystack insight that we could then, create magic out of. So by the time I moved over into the corporate world, I think that had already shaped how I thought about things. And I think my litmus for believing the impossible could be possible was very much influenced by the early days of my career, that's exactly what agencies are hired to do. And then through my corporate career, I think I've just had the opportunity to work with some amazing teams, and some amazing leaders that I worked for that allowed us the room and the safe space to try and go after things in a way that would, I think, when you started thinking how difficult it would be, but then when you got there, thought, wow, this is pretty magical.
Is there a specific instance that comes to mind where you thought, hey, this is something really risky, but let me bring this person in the mix? Maybe it was on the agency side where you said, hey, we're just not sure about this. I'm curious, was there a moment, a specific idea? And then, how did that come together?
Look, I think if you're asking me for a specific moment, I think when I was working at Petco, every day we had to really rethink what we're going to do with that business because we were in a turnaround situation. We were transforming from becoming a traditional four-wall brick and mortar retailer to really need to be differentiated. And to do that, we decided we were going to go after really becoming a health and wellness company for pets. And that really meant showing up in a different way. And if you think about what it would require to show up for a customer that way, you can't do that from inside of marketing. You have to function with a much more collaborative cross-functional view of the enterprise to get those kind of things done. I remember one meeting in particular, I had just started and I had asked the CTO for a meeting because one of the biggest initiatives we knew we needed to achieve this connection with pet parents was to really think about how we're going to use data in a different way. And to use that data had to move across the enterprise in a different way. So I asked him for this meeting to talk about what I thought was going to be required from inherently marketing, but from a customer experience perspective. And I remember he turned and looked at me at one point. He said, this may be the first time I've ever had a CMO ask for the meeting and organize a conversation that was technology led with the acknowledgement that was what was required to get the work done. And so that's dating myself. I think those meetings happen a lot more today. But if I think about the amazing work we went on to do at Petco, it was enabled by understanding how to take the power of data and really understand that down to a singular pet level and their parent to understand what they needed And that impacted how we then created product, and impacted how we defined services, and it ultimately impacted how we positioned the brand and talked about it in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I wouldn't downplay that. I mean, you're right. It is happening more now than it was a few years ago, but that wasn't that long ago. And I know plenty of companies still today where things are very siloed, and often the marketers aren't really thinking about who are some of the other folks within the organization or even externally that we should be talking to from a capability standpoint, or thinking about how are we going to get to where we're going faster. So, I wouldn't take that for granted.
No, I don't. I think it goes back to that whole integration mindset. I don't think I realized it when I was learning it in grad school, but in many ways, here I am almost 30 years later. I think I'm actually applying more of what would have been theoretical skills to get my degree back then. And I'm using those capabilities more now because technology enablement has caught up, and data access and movement of that data have now gotten to a place where things we were learning in theory are really now a reality. So I think it comes in a much more natural, fluid way for me because I don't know any better. It's how I grew up thinking about these things. I was just waiting for the technology and tech infrastructure and data enablement to allow us to actually apply it.
When you moved on from Petco, you went to a very, very large organization, right? You went to McDonald's from there.
Yeah.
I'm curious, whether at Petco or at McDonald's, maybe even on the agency side of things, in the roles you'd had, how did you keep people feeling connected, right? You gave the example of the CTO, but how did you keep people connected in such a big organization? How did you make sure that the messages were consistent internally before you even thought about going externally?
But I was fortunate in the last two organizations I worked within where the culture extends well beyond the walls of the company and into the lives of our fans. And so there wasn't a tremendous amount of effort. You think of McDonald's as actually a much bigger company than it actually is in terms of the just sheer number of people in the organization. The time there was massive as it relates to the span of franchise organizations you work with. But the immediate corporate organization actually is a lot smaller than most people realize. But having said that, I don't think size actually had anything to do with it. I think the culture and the values of the brand be well beyond marketing and well beyond what you speak to the customer about are so embedded inside the culture of the company. And I think that's what we lit up inside of Petco. I don't think it was as present when we joined as a leadership team. But the first signal came from the people in our stores who inherently had such a close connection with the animals and the parents they were working with. It became contagious for us as a leadership to figure out how to unlock that. And so quite often, you look for the values that are inside an organization because your best efforts are only amplified when that culture is present. And they're hindered. You can do your best to try and create those connections you're talking about. But if they're not inherently woven into the fabric of the organization that the leadership is building, your best efforts will only get you so far.
If you had to pick 3 values that you'd say are the ones that stood out most to you as the game changers, the sort of X factor, what would those be?
Oh, ironically, I think they were relatively the same in my last 2 roles in particular. I think they were incredible empathy and understanding of the customer. And in our case, we talked about them as fans at McDonald's and we talked about them as parents, at Petco. Even those phrases alone, right, have an emotional, evocative intent attached to them. So I would say empathy and authenticity. They were truly relationships. And unless you're authentic, those relationships are not, clearly understood and you'll get called on it. Right. I would say, a value for, not standing still, a value for innovation and for transformation and recognizing that the opportunity was fluid. And unless we moved, whether in the case of Petco where things were challenging, we didn't move, we're going to have a bigger problem. And in the case of McDonald's, the business had challenges and I came in as we were starting to figure our way out of those challenges. And so I think that requires a willingness and a culture to take those steps forward. And I think though, I would say on the third one, I think it's inherently around creating an environment where people have that psychological safety to go after it, right? And you're removing that fear of failure. And those were not actually present in either of the organizations I was in most recently, but we worked hard to really create that psychological safety for our teams because I just don't believe you can actually get to that kind of great innovative spirit if folks are concerned about that. They don't feel like that their leadership has their back.
What do you think was the biggest barrier to that? Why do you think it wasn't already there in place?
Oh, I don't think there's a singular thing there. I think those things manifest themselves in cultures in a variety of ways. And I talk about this a lot is, sort of like there are ghosts in culture, right? So it's not even necessarily a reflection of the existing leadership. It may not even be, leadership 2 and 3 before. But if a company's been around long enough, sometimes the structural aspects of the culture that inhibit people from doing those things are still present. And so I think part of it is just understanding how fear manifests itself, not only as an organization, but you have to understand how fear manifests itself in individuals, people who work for you, because that's not always something is created by the leader or by the corporate culture. We all come with our own elements that drive our willingness to either step into it or step away from it, right? And so I think part of it's listening, learning, trying to be in tune with where those signals are coming from, but then being overt with the actions to counter them, because these are not always things that are just overtly a barrier you pick up and move. Some of these are really subtle. Some of them have been there for a long time, and some of them are hidden. Some of them are unspoken. And so part of it is just, breaking those things down and listening before you decide how to move forward.
And ghosts is such a great way to put it. I actually haven't heard anyone say it that way before, because you're right. It's sort of this like invisible thing that not everyone sees, but you might feel it and you're sort of present with it, right? It's there, but not everyone even knows how to deal with it. That's such an interesting way to phrase it.
Well, people associate it with people. It's ironically, sometimes it can be the association of a specific leader or leadership teams, but I believe from what I've seen, it's a little bit of a fallacy to assume that just because you move people in and out, that those dimensions don't still exist in a culture. Well after some of the folks that created some of those fears are no longer in the organization. And so I think it's more about just listening and learning, and providing an alternative, narrative for people to start to glom onto and then feel trusted and feel safe enough to be able to do that.
Is there a specific example you can think of where those ideas around psychological safety, is there a moment where the idea of psychological safety came to life for the team and the difference that you saw as a result?
Now, look, when I joined the last organizations, and in particular, at McDonald's, I took an action forward specifically against it. I just couldn't understand why we weren't taking more risks, right? The leadership was giving signals that there was room to, that it was safe to. And people, you go into town halls and you talk about it, people would nod and they'd smile and feel great. And then they'd leave and go back to their day-to-day job and things wouldn't change. And I had an old boss who used to say, look, say it once, say it twice, but then you got to do an action to go with it, right? And it's like everything in our lives. You have to apply an action to change habits. And so I went back and I said to my leadership team, we're going to get together quarterly and we are going to look at the nominations for the absolutely greatest failures of the quarter. And I use those words together very intentionally because I do believe there is a way to fail greatly. Right. And so we talked about it as a team and what does that look like, right? Have you laid out a clear objective? Do you have a clear cross-functional team that's working on it? Have you laid out what success looks like? What are the KPIs for success? Have you kept people involved along the way so there's no surprises, right? And then when you get to the end, is there some form of exhaust from the experience that either provides the organization the benefit to keep, tack and keep going the right way to get where you want to get to? Or put it down and learn from it in a way that either gives you a byproduct that takes you into some other great area of success, or that the organization prevents itself from doing that in the future. And being able to talk about that in the same way that we talk about other systems in an organization. And then what we would do quarterly is we would talk about the nominations, and then we would award one of them what we called the Amazing Almost Awards. And I wanted to just create a vernacular in the culture where we took a minute to celebrate people who'd gone about going after something the right way, right? And they had failed greatly, create an environment where we could talk about it, learn from it, apply it, and over time start to allow the organization to feel and understand, oh, this is as important as the things we do when we get it absolutely right. And I felt like as we were getting more and more data, and certainly now it's moved into AI, that was an even more critical thing to do, because we're on the precipice of creating organizations that are all just structured around the data making you do things. And so I felt it's really important. I've had great leaders that have taught me, you got to challenge the intimacy behind the data, right? data in and of itself is not always just a straight red, yellow, green light response to things. Sometimes it's actually having the conversation, asking questions behind the data that lead you into the real powerful outcomes.
There's two ideas actually from what I just heard from you that are super interesting, and I feel like I don't hear much. So one is the idea of almost being positive. I mean, I think of that idea, almost doesn't count, and I've got the song by Brandy going through my head right now, but you're basically saying almost does count, and you want to encourage it, and you want to say that, you know, you tried and you may not have gotten to your goal, but you still learned along the way, and you want to try again. You want to keep trying because failure is reframed, right? As this sort of almost, it's a win, which I think is super interesting. And I hear it and I say it, but I haven't heard it framed in that way.
Well, you actually have in the industry.
Okay.
And I used to talk about it with my leadership and, you know, I said to them, what do startups call failure?
Yeah.
They call them pivots. Right?
Yeah.
Companies pivot because in the case of a startup, you have to reframe where you're going in order to continue to fundraise, right? To lifeblood of growth success.
Yeah.
So you can't go in and have that conversation and talk about the miserable failure. What you can do is go in and talk about having great failures and again, that byproduct of what you learned allowed you to pivot the company, right? So language is a really important element here. And so I did it deliberately to play on those words, but I also did it culturally to try and bring in a little bit of that more entrepreneurial startup mindset into a corporate culture.
And the other idea then that you mentioned, and, you know, it's good that you say that about words, is the intimacy of data. Tell me more about that idea.
I worked for an amazing leader when I was at HP. He was the president of the division, scientist by trade, invented the laser printer. And what I learned from him, he had the ability to sit in meetings where presentations would be given. He'd gone through the reams of data. People are presenting, right? Data point after data point after data point, and then they're done, right? And it's like exclamation point. Therefore, and he would start to ask a myriad of questions. It could be from having seen a study with an alternative perspective on it. It could have been from having seen a sociological or anthropological study that created a question in his mind. And slowly, right, that very straight, proud standing exclamation point would slowly start to turn into a question mark, right? And I framed that phrase intimacy of data because what he was doing was he was not just, it's not to suggest all data should be viewed this way, right? There's lots of data that's, you know, yes, right, stop, go. His point was a bigger point. And he never used to say this, but I've come to learn it, which is when you get to the place where you have that absolute conviction around it, that conviction only grows stronger by asking one more question. So can you question those elements, right? That's what I mean by the intimacy of it. Can you get into it now and either drive additional conviction, drive the need for one more check onto something, or does it open up doubt? And that's okay, right? And I just don't know that we spend enough time really determining whether we're asking the right question because we're so rapidly pursuing the answer, right? So that's what I mean by intimacy of data.
What would you say then are the right questions that we should be asking?
Oh, I think it varies to the situation you're in, the problem that you're solving. But the fact of the matter is quite often we design things for an answer. And again, that's not to suggest I don't think we should have hypotheses or we shouldn't be pursuing an objective, a clear one. But on the way to really making sure that you actually have the right objective in order to test it, have you really asked enough questions that allow you to feel that way? Even if you talk to the founders of Google, they will tell you the notion of search was never given to give you an answer. It was actually to give you a variant number of other possibilities and additional questions until you felt like you had all the things you needed to bring your own point of view together. I think AI functions even more so like that today, right? The need for us to bring that human mindset and human conditioning to it, I actually believe is going to be even more critical. And I get concerned that if we don't maintain this sort of psychological safety and the ability for people to still question and actually create that as a requirement for our folks, that we will reinforce an even more strict structural behavior of the data made me do it, right? And I just think that's a dangerous pathway to head down.
I hear you. And, with AI specifically, even if it's something as simple as, something that's a writing companion, something that's helping you write your emails or, research or whatever it might be. One of the things that I'm hearing as a concern is it going to create this sense of sameness, right? Are we just going to be hearing the same thing from everyone? Is it just going to be clear that it came from AI and no one's going to have their individual opinions? And so as a result, it might stomp on innovation. It might drive things towards a status quo. What would you say to that?
I think that's up to us, right? The reality is, as we move forward, like I'm insanely excited about AI as a totality, what we can do with things. But that reality is that information just got democratized. So in many cases and in many situations, that sameness you call out is accurate. That's actually where our job as marketers and as leaders in organizations come in to create differentiation. This is why I believe brands will not be less important in the AI world. They'll be even more important. This is why I believe the queries that we put in will require even more human insight, because it's that query that then drives the next level of learning to enhance that algorithmic output, right? And so I actually don't worry about us having all roughly the same amount of information. That's kind of back to the future. Before it was, we all just didn't have the same rough kind of information, right? I think you take that same mindset and you just start to develop, what your points of differentiation are going to be. And that is a very humanistic thing to do.
So knowing that is the humanistic thing to do and thinking about all the voices that can come into whether it's an idea, a campaign, or even product development, right? The idea of community comes up a lot for me. I think about all the voices that are coming in and this idea of reciprocity. In your experience, how did that idea of community marry with sort of the data that you see? How do you make community not just a nice to have or a soft thing, but really infrastructure or structure so that it's married to the data? Because I hear you talking a lot about that data. How do you make that connection?
Yeah, look, it was very much strategically present in the success that the team that I had the pleasure and honor to lead at McDonald's was literally built in. So when we got there, the business had been on about a 7-year stunt, had lost traction with pretty much every segment, most concerningly the younger end of the segment. I don't have to tell you in the quick service business that's a real problem. It had woken up the brand with a campaign, with an execution, with Travis Scott and Famous Orders. That had been a uniquely successful connect back to the marketplace. And that was right around when I joined. And I said to the team, congratulations. You've now called culture. Culture's now calling back, right? You're now in a dialogue. But you're a little like the dog who caught the bus. Now what? Because we're not going to be in a position where if we think the next thing to do is just to continue a campaign to solve that, it's not going to solve it. You now have exposed yourself to your community and to your fans. Now you actually have to create a participatory model where they know you're authentic, you're present, and you're enduring in that community relationship. And so we talked about going after a very specific goal, and that was to make McDonald's a cultural icon. We were certainly an iconic brand, but we had lost our connect with culture. And we defined 4 pillars to get there. And the first one was, look, we're a food company, so we're going to play with our food and we're going to start to reflect and connect with culture. That's where you saw things like great breakthroughs on simple things like dipping sauces, right? Reflecting the taste of Asian markets or Hispanic markets, things that were prevalent across the culinary world in populations that we didn't want to copy, but we wanted to find a way to do in a way that made sense for McDonald's. The second one was actually just spending time just living in the culture of our fans, right? So we didn't invent the TikTok food hack, but we sure could play in one and create and did something in a space that could have. We didn't necessarily set out to deliberately sort of say like, oh, that's happening over there, let's go participate in it. We just understood the signals of what the relevance of the McDonald's brand was in the lives of our fans and what was going on culturally around us so that we could do things that could authentically participate. But then the third pillar, to your point, we actually said we were going to make data part of our cultural strategy. Because what we understood about the marketplace was they already knew you were tracking them. And the reality was they were fine with that as long as you were using that data to provide some value back. And for us, that value could come in the form of experiences, allowing people access to things they wouldn't have had access to in culture, right? The adult Happy Meal and working with Cactus Plant Flea Market gave people the ability to have a little access of culture that they might not have otherwise been able to afford, but be able to experience it in a $10 meal and be able to have that connect with it, right? So it's providing that opportunity to participate in it. Those were all data elements that helped us start to do that. And then the last one was we weren't going to just participate in culture. We're going to actually create cultural moments where people could engage, participate, and start to see that the way we were using our understanding of them and ultimately the data around them in a way that added value to their lives. That's how you drive frequency, connection, and depth of brand that you're talking about, and differentiation to move away from that sameness you were asking about.
So looking back now, through the career you've had, shifting gears a little bit, what would you say is a moment that you're, particularly proud of?
I guess if my daughter were here, she would say he's never done. And so I probably am guilty of not, taking a moment to celebrate in the moments where things have gone particularly well. I'm usually looking at the next peak and saying like, how do we go climb that? But if I look across it, the universal theme that I would say would be, the greatest success would be around the people that I've had the opportunity to work with, the people I've had the opportunity to develop and lead in certain cases. And then the work in totality, right? When I look at the experience I had at McDonald's for the last 4 years or at Petco leading up to the successful IPO, I don't really look at one sort of piece of it. I think it's the whole cloth of the story and the narrative that we were building and our ability to then connect. If I go down to the sort of KPI level of success of things, I am incredibly proud of the team at McDonald's. When I joined the organization, we had roughly just south of 20 million users on the app and on the platform. When I left, we had just south of 100 million, of which 50% of them were 90-day actives. By 2027, that number will be about 65 million 90-day actives. That's a massive, talk about community. That's a massive customer platform community. And I'm incredibly proud of the transformation on both the Petco business and the McDonald's business that we led to really start to figure out how to unlock the brand and the relationship through data, through technology, and creating these digital moments where we reconnected the brands in very new, unique ways that were really about the value for the customer. I think I'm incredibly proud of the work that the teams did, but I'm also incredibly proud of the results that they drove in doing so, because all those things have been interesting, but if we weren't driving business results behind them, then all for naught.
Yeah. And both of those things are connected. What I heard from you is reach and engagement, right? The numbers are massive. Going from 20 million to 100 million, insane. That's in a short period of time, right?
Yeah.
But to see that over that 90-day period that you said, when it comes to actives, that number is scaling so quickly, that's engagement. That's a much harder thing to do, right?
Yeah, I used to say to the team, look, downloads are amazing, but that frequency of connect and that engagement, that's where the magic really happens, right? That's the stuff that I get really excited about, because that means we've not only connected, but they want to stay connected and participate with us.
Yeah. And it sounds like there's some element of trust within that. What do you think is the role that trust plays in growing and keeping that engagement?
I think that's the new critical KPI for brands as they go forward is going to be trust and reputation, particularly as you enter into a place of having even more data, right? The threshold for willingness is only going to go up, and the value requirement is only going to go up, and it all erodes in a heartbeat the minute the trust is broken with it, right? Look, we on the way to growing that engagement population, we had a program where we were going to put 2 million new users on the app in a month. It's a pretty crazy target for the team to go after. We could have just done back of the napkin and figured out what the cost of acquisition would be and run promotions and done it. Scale a business like McDonald's, you could do that. But instead, the team, again, understanding culture, understanding they wanted something that was enduring beyond the 30 days. Instead, they built a program over the 30-day window that allowed customers to engage, participate, and ultimately convict themselves to the brand, right? Well, we had food hacks, we had food offers, we had merchandise, and then every Saturday we had a concert in the app. And the only way you could go to the concert was to be in the app, right? So at the end of the 30 days, we did it. We put 2 million new users onto the business. But I think if you spoke to them, they wouldn't have talked about entering through a promotion. They would have talked about actually having a unique experience with the brand that made them want to engage, right? I don't talk about brand or performance. You've heard me before. I don't believe in brand or performance. I believe in brand performance. I think the things we do to drive the brand have absolute transactional performance requirements to them. And I think the things we do to drive performance, you can do in a uniquely defined branded way. And I think that will become increasingly important as we move forward.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. I want to ask a few questions about sort of your day-to-day life outside of work and how it sort of applies and how things bridge. What I'm wondering is, with the work that you're doing, it's intense, right? The work you're doing is intense. The work teams are doing around you when you're working together is intense. You have some big goals. How do you make sure that there's sort of routines or habits in place to maintain your health and well-being?
Well, look, I think the first place it starts with is actually your people. So as difficult as my days are day in and day out, I've got a group of people I'm responsible for that you've got to create an environment that takes them into consideration. Because at the end of the day, no matter how hard we as leaders work, it's nothing compared to the people that are working for the business, right? And so I actually get a lot of my energy from understanding what's going on with my people, being around them, listening, learning with them kind of things that they need. And so that actually brings down a level of stress for me if I know that we've got the right engagement and the right, equally it goes up when I know there's a need, a want, and a concern. So when they get it right happens, though, I will tell you, it makes the things when you walk out of the office a lot easier to let go and relax. But to answer your question, I bring the work home I need to get done if I need to get it done, but I don't bring my work home through a traditional way of thinking through the task ahead. I do it by looking at culture. I really enjoy studying culture, being around culture. McDonald's was an amazing chapter for me because I love food. I love to cook. I love to spend time in the kitchen. And so for me, culture and food go hand in hand. It goes all the way back to that huge Middle Eastern family I was talking about. And that for me is a great way to decompress when I come home, whether I'm cooking for other people or even just for myself. So food and cultural elements of things, travel is a big thing for me. I try to stay active, probably not as active as I'd like to, but whether that's finding some time to meditate or spending some time on the yoga mat or just out walking with the dog, probably not getting to the gym as much as I'd like to, but that fits in there somewhere. And then I mentioned at the top about my earliest memories. I'm trying to create those same kind of memories with my daughter and my family. And so that to me is where I go and find that oxygen is my family, my extended circle of friends who are like family. We travel and we spend time together. I try to remove things as opposed to add things to do that for me.
What is something that you do daily on a recurring basis that you think really helps you stay healthy and well?
Yeah, I love this question. We had this question at an offsite with our teams. What's your morning routine? And I can honestly tell you, and my mom would roll her eyes and laugh. I'm not much of a typical routine person. I try to get my energy right and recognize when it's not. And try and clear my head. And I don't think it's always necessarily one thing that does that for me. So unlike certain people who have like this sort of regimented routine, I think the dyslexic in me kind of loves not having necessarily everything the same. I like variety. I think it's more about, trying to manage my energy stores, getting the right amount of rest and being in recognition whether those are in tune or out of sync and being aware of that when I'm, because those are the moments when you have the potential to not be at your best. And the easiest way to avoid them is to have some kind of self-awareness around them.
What would you say is your superpower?
Well, I alluded to it. I think it was a late to life superpower for me. I was diagnosed with dyslexia quite late. It was almost my senior year of high school before I knew something, my folks certainly knew something wasn't working quite right when I was younger, but, didn't really have it pinned until really later into high school. And then it took me a long time to both figure out how to manage through it and, put the right coping mechanisms in place. And then most of my professional career to actually move from, rather than like keeping that as something I kept secret, to something that I actually recognized as actually one of my natural superpowers, because dyslexic have a tendency to look at things differently. It's just, we can't help it, right? It's the motor processing of the visual and thinking process that takes place that actually creates some of the challenge. There's a whole other upside to it, which is getting to the same destination in a different way. And that different way sometimes unlocks incredibly unique, distinct, and creative opportunities.
Yeah, I feel that really deeply. I'm not dyslexic, but I was diagnosed with ADHD just a couple years ago, pretty late in my life as well. And it's been interesting to kind of look back and see all the connective points being like, oh yeah, this is why that happened, or this is why I saw things a certain way that was different than others. It helped me sort of see things that maybe others wouldn't have. Yeah. What advice would you give to someone who would like to follow in your footsteps?
Start a new set of footsteps would be my first piece of advice. Look, I would tell you my greatest of advice to people is to follow the path of experience as opposed to the defined path that quite often we create for ourselves, the A to B to C approach to things. That I'm a big believer. I'm not inherently big on structural religion, but I'm pretty spiritual in the sense that I believe that life creates these moments for you to potentially go places you never imagined. I joke around and say, you asked at the beginning, was there a specific professional career I was thinking about? I mean, I interned at a law firm for 3 years in undergrad and thought I was going to go to law school. And I always say, like, I became a CMO. Funny thing happened on the way to law school, right? I could have chosen to sort of like ignore that desire to pursue something and let an experience take me a new direction, because I could have just followed the roadmap. And so I guess what I would say is live an experiential life, go off the map, leave the route, try things early on. In particular, I mean, I have a daughter who just started her freshman year of college, and my biggest piece of advice to her going in was, don't go to college to learn how to become something. Go to college to learn how to become you, right? I don't think that changes in our career. Your greatest happiness, and I believe success follows right behind it, is if you're pursuing your career, not to necessarily follow the path of a career, but to follow the path of who you are and who you want to become or who you want to change as you go along those pathways. And that can be hard the further on in our careers we go.
So as we think about superpowers and our individual talents, then, whether it is in college, finding those, recognizing those, whether it is in your working career, do you think individual talent matters less than the community around it?
I think it's less about individual talent. I think it's more about, and I think both of those have to be coexisting. To my earlier point about growing up in the family I grew up in, that influenced my belief of what I could be and couldn't be successful, right? So your community and your environment around you are great sources of inspiration. They can also be great sources of holding you back if they're not the right elements as well, right? I go back to this, and again, I think it's what happened when I started to understand my own ability to navigate the challenges of dyslexia. And I think it's why I lean so hard into this dimension of fear removal. Because for a long time, the biggest byproduct of my dyslexia was my own fear, right? Fear of how to navigate it, and then fear of being outed about it, right? Like I might be broken or something. And it wasn't until I started to understand and embrace that and create my own psychological safety that I started to take chances and do some of those things in a different way, right? Also do it in a more responsible way, because there were other times when I was doing it just out of pure rebellion, and that's not responsible either, right? That's why I use the phrase fail greatly. It's not running with scissors, but it's allowing yourself that opportunity and recognize the outcome may not turn out like you planned, but having the fortitude, the confidence, and the ability to learn from that byproduct to become back something even bigger and better as you keep going, right? So, I think it's trying to find cultures that I can be in where they recognize the importance of that psychological safety and the power of it to remove the barriers, to allow people to really pursue amazement. And that's at the center of that, that's at the center of my true north, right? My Ikigai is all about helping amazing people achieve extraordinary things. That is my true north at this point in my career. Yes, the business results are important. Yes, the success of role are important. But the measurement of success for me are about the byproduct of what it does to allow other people to achieve incredible success as they move forward.
Mm-hmm. If that isn't grounded in community, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
What would you say is something that you haven't mentioned yet that most people don't know about you or would be surprised by?
I'm a pretty authentic, open leader, so I'm scrambling to try and find something that people. I think the dyslexia one is a big one for me. It's not something I talk about a lot, but I have started to more so at this point in my career because I realize that not only the power behind it, but I also recognize it's a responsibility for others who are trying to find their voice with their own differences. And I think that's held true, whether it's about, that particular, I call it superpower, not challenge, managing it. But I also think it's why you've seen I've had such conviction and passion around, creating opportunity for people who haven't had the same chances and the same opportunities and underrepresented communities and being present to do that. I mean, I guess there's very little out there. I'm very proud of that, by the way. I think one of the things that I'm most proud of when I leave an organization is having people that work with me thank me for being an authentic and open, vulnerable leader. Maybe someone will give you a better one for me that they know on me that I don't. Maybe I'll leave myself open to someone else calling it in for you.
Yeah, no, but that's a good one. Dyslexia, you're right, because, most people wouldn't know that. And to your point, it's something that is often seen as a barrier. But like you said, you found a way to recognize that it's part of your superpower. That's a very different and powerful thing.
Yeah.
What book that you've read recently, or, maybe even not so recently, would you recommend to others? Something that's moved you?
Something that moved. I read a book. It ties back to what we've talked about when you said to me advice, and this goes back to sort of my biggest life is to live your experience. It wasn't that recent, but I read The Midnight Library a little while ago, which in its short term, without giving it away, because you don't want to give it away, it's figuratively and literally plays into the what could have been chapters of our lives. And all of us have chapters that think, gosh, if I had turned right instead of left, maybe this. And it's a fascinating exploration to all of those right and left turns that still all bring you back, no matter which turn you have taken, to a central point. And I'll leave that to others to go and discover, because ultimately I think it's a really personal discovery when you're done reading it.
Okay. All right, it's time for the lightning round. Are you ready?
Sure.
Comedy or drama?
Drama.
Roller coasters or bumper cars?
Roller coasters.
Day or night?
Morning.
We're gonna say that's a day. Okay. All right. Teleportation or time travel?
Time travel.
Breakfast, sweet or savory?
Seldom. Savory.
Seldom. Okay. All right. Not the most important meal of the day, clearly. Okay.
No, I'm an intermittent faster, so I don't. But if I'm going to, savory.
Okay. You mentioned that you cook a lot. Is there a go-to dish or recipe that you'd say is like your thing?
No. Who am I cooking for matters more than what that is.
Okay.
I like to think about the audience I'm cooking for.
Okay. Always the marketer. All right. I like that. All right. Well, listen, final question. What would you say is your go-to hype song?
Oh, it really depends on the mood. I'll go with one that my team gave me as I was leaving McDonald's. It was, I Like It Like That.
Nice. Okay. All right. Well, listen, that's it for me. I really appreciate you making the time. It was great to have this conversation. So thank you.
Oh, it's so good to see you, my friend. It's been much too long and great. Enjoyed the conversation.